For me, it's very sad to see how quickly people can turn to utopic ideas and how our country went to the left, to this radical progressive ideas that destroy a lot of people, a lot of countries. So
Indiana Congresswoman-elect Victoria Spartz sounding off about the push towards socialism after she herself moved to the United States from Ukraine. This is former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley is crowning 2020 the year socialism went mainstream. So what could happen if the push towards the far left gains more steam in 2021? Back with Carol Roth and Scott Martin. Carol, you say that you question anyone who's watching the government in action who still believes in socialism.
Yeah, you must be reading my Twitter stream, Jackie. I mean, it is absolutely amazing. After this past year, everything that went wrong because of government intervention. Everything that went right because of at least the private sector and some semblance of capitalism, maybe not full capitalism. But when you look at what's happened with central planning, there is more and more power and concentration and spending across the board at every single level, and it is moving us further away from capitalism, and it's to our economic detriment, and it's to the detriment of our freedoms and what makes America so unique and why people risk life and limb to come here. I mean, nobody's trying to escape capitalism to go to a socialist country.
Yeah, it's interesting, Scott, because the Democrats are trying to basically rebrand socialism. They've realized that if you actually speak those words, it could spook people, especially people from other countries who have lived through it and seen it happen and seen that it's actually gradual through policies that slowly but surely start to creep in and start to take over. And so they're backing away and saying, don't use that word anymore. We've got to sort of call it progressiveness and focus on that aspect of it. There are people, Scott, who will say, oh, it can never happen in this country. We will never be socialist. And then there are others that say never, because in other countries, it happened over time, too.
It did, Jackie, and I would argue we're closer to socialism in the United States than we've ever been. And the reasons for that are many. I wouldn't totally blame Joe Biden yet for some of that, but it could be. And certainly, I think, as you talked about, I mean, look at some of those countries and look at the lack of economic progress they've had over the last decades. Look at the liberties that have been taken away, the freedoms that, like you talked about, many of the citizens who have been fortunate to leave have fled them for reasons therein. So to me, you have to be very careful of where we go going forward, coming out of, say, this COVID pandemic, and what we do going forward to kind of unlock that entrepreneurial spirit, to reward the capitalist nature of this system that we've built here. And hopefully that's something that turns out better than the way it looks right now.
Yeah, it's interesting, Carol, because yesterday we had a congressman-elect on, along with 3 other GOP members, women, female members, that are sort of taking on the squad, if you will, and trying to educate people and make sure that they really understand what it is they're voting for, what it is they're asking for when they align with someone like AOC or Bernie Sanders, for example. I think part of the problem here is education, that most people just don't necessarily understand it.
No, they don't, and they believe in unicorns and fairies, and they don't believe in human nature. That's the interesting thing about capitalism. It really harnesses human nature, while socialism pretends that it doesn't exist. But I think we need to rebrand. We can just call it central planning. Anything that consolidates power, anything that uses force and control and coercion, versus free markets, because capitalism's got a bad name too. So free markets, freedom, choice, and decentralization. We are always going to have more prosperity. We're going to be aligned with individual rights, and it's going to protect the smallest minority in the entire world, which is the individual, if we move towards more free markets. If you start moving more towards central planning, you're going to have less and less of that. And unfortunately, if you give a little, we know it ends up being a lot, because like people say, people are greedy, and people in the government are greedy. Unfortunately, you have to deal with them.
Yeah, real quick, Scott, when it comes to the stock market, we're watching it go higher and higher. Part of that is because of the policies that President Trump implemented with respect to business, even amidst the pandemic. You start to change that around, you're going to throw cold water on this really quickly, and it will impact a lot of people invested, not just the bigwigs, the people who have the pensions and the 401ks too.
Yep, and we had tax cuts to boot, Jackie, over the last several years that were a boon to economic growth and stock prices. Those are threatened to be going away. So all this debt that we've created over the last, just not say the last few years, but certainly the last couple decades will have to come home to roost. We're going to have to pay for that through more regulations and more taxes.
All right, guys, thanks so much for that. Coming up on the